Hi, I'm Willis. Welcome to my Shadowmoon Burial Grounds Mythic Dungeon Guide. In this video, I'll extensively cover the abilities of all enemies you will face in a Shadowmoon Burial Grounds run. Shadowmoon Burial Grounds is a rather old dungeon, and as such is not very mechanically complex when compared to newer dungeons. Nonetheless, it can be sufficiently difficult in certain portions. I'll be making a dungeon guide on all 8 of the slated Mythic Plus dungeons for Dragonflight Season 1, so be sure to subscribe if you want to catch those. Just like with my Shadowlands guides, I'll be marking important or impactful mob abilities in red, and less important abilities in green. Additionally, I'll be marking out abilities with their associated counterplay, including magic effects, enrages, curses, interrupts, bleeds for Draktheirs, and poisons or diseases. Let's begin. You enter the dungeon and are greeted by a pack of 3 mobs. The first among them is the Shadowmoon Bonemender. The Mender primarily casts Shadow Bolt, dealing significant damage to a targeted party member. Interrupting this is a priority. They also cast Shadow Mend, a significant heal on a random enemy. This is also a priority interrupt. Finally is Shadow Word Frailty. This era of WoW seems to have a few abilities that don't have a cast time. Frailty is one of them. This is a magic debuff which deals significant damage to a player and reduces their max health for 15 seconds. Healers dispel this as soon as you can. The other mobs surrounding the Mender are the Reanimated Ritual Bones. This mob only damages the tank through their ability Void Slash. This ability does do a significant amount of damage, so tanks watch out. Down the hall, you face another mob, the Void Spawn. You'll see this again later at the end of the dungeon, so remember the abilities. It primarily casts Void Pulse, dealing damage to any players caught in their line of sight. In higher keys, when the damage may be overwhelming, line of sighting this ability is recommended. Otherwise, their only other cast is Void Eruptions, throwing out several bombs that can be easily dodged. The dungeon is relatively linear, so going left or right doesn't matter too much. On either side, you'll meet 2 new mobs. The first is the Shadowmoon Loyalist. The Loyalist only casts Sinister Focus, granting them a 100% attack and movement speed buff. You'll want to Dispel or Spellsteal this. The game files mention a Shadow Bolt, an interruptible direct damage cast, but I haven't seen this used in any of my runs. The other mob is the Defiled Spirit. They also only cast one ability, Cry of Anguish. This is where they teleport to a random party member and cry in a 6-yard radius. This deals significant damage and pacifies players' hit for 3 seconds. You'll want to step out of these. Moving past that, you face an army of baby spiders that don't do anything, just rapidly kill them and jump down a hole. You face more baby spiders, you kill those spiders too. Then you face another pack. We've seen all the mobs here before, just interrupt and tanks keep your defensives up. And you're already at the first boss, Sadana Bloodfury. This fight involves conserving space in a small arena surrounded by death runes. Stepping on purple runes will deal damage to you, so don't. The fight starts with Bloodfury summoning daggers through Daggerfall. This places 3 daggers in the arena on the positions of 3 random players. These daggers leave behind a puddle of hurt that should be avoided. Be careful where you stand. Ensure that you don't cover the moon surrounding the center tablet. The boss then casts Whispers of the Dark, dealing continuous unavoidable damage to the whole party. This needs to be healed through. The boss will then cast Dark Communion. This summons a defiled spirit to walk towards the boss. Should this spirit reach the boss, they will be healed for 10% of their max health and be granted a 10% damage buff. You'll want to slow and kill this ad as a priority. Bloodfury's big ability is Dark Eclipse. She covers the arena in a shadow of an eclipse and deals lethal damage at the end of a cast to anyone not standing on any of the glowing moon runes around the room. I suspect that the runes are supposed to be corrupted after you use them, as mentioned in the dungeon journal, but it does not happen in practice. Finally, the boss may sometimes be granted a buff that causes them to deal additional melee damage to the tank. Tanks, if you see this, pop a defensive in preparation of the incoming damage. And that's all for the first fight. Just conserve your space effectively and it should be quite easy. I find a good strategy here is for the entire group to stack up so the daggers are all baited to the same location. We make our way through the catacombs and face a new set of mobs. The first among them is the Shadowmoon Enslaver. When you first encounter them, they can be seen casting Domination on a subjugated soul. Domination increases the soul's damage and health by 100%. It's not very intuitive, but you probably don't want to interrupt these enslavers, as keeping them occupied mind-controlling these souls is better than what they would do if they were free. Should you interrupt them out of their initial domination, they cast 2 abilities. The first is Domination, again. This time, instead of casting it on those souls, they cast it on a random party member. Should they successfully cast it, that player will be mind-controlled. This is an absolute priority interrupt. They also cast Rending Void Slash, dealing significant damage to a player every second for 5 seconds. That is also a priority interrupt. And the Enslaver casts both of these frequently. Outside of extremely coordinated groups with very good interrupts, I highly recommend to just kill the souls and don't interrupt those enslavers. The souls themselves do nothing, they only melee. Past that, you face a few Shadowmoon Exhumers. These mobs, when encountered, will cast Exhume the Crypts, waking up several skeletons from their rest. In addition to this, the Exhumers will then spam cast Void Bolt, dealing significant damage to a random party member. You'll want to interrupt that. The Exhumed Spirits themselves also cast Void Bolt, very frequently. Each Exhumer will awaken 2 skeletons each. If your group is lacking interrupts or coordination, I would not recommend pulling both of the Exhumers at the same time. The Exhumed Spirits will have 50% of their health as shields, so dispel this if you want to speed up the kills. Farther past that, you enter a large cave surrounded by small tombstones. These tombstones are traps. If you get within melee distance of these tombstones, you awaken them, spawning an Exhumed Spirit. You don't want to pull these unnecessarily, and especially not during the boss fight. Now you face Nhallish. This boss fight isn't too complicated. The fight starts with the boss casting Void Lash on the current tank. It's a tracking breath frontal, so tanks face it away and stand still. The boss often follows that up with Planar Shift. They'll jump to a random party member, then begin to channel Void Vortex, pulling players in and dealing damage in a small AoE. Just run out. Then, at regular intervals, the boss will cast Soul Steal, sending all players into the Shadow Dimension. Every player, including the tank and the healer, will now have 60 seconds to kill their own soul to escape this dimension. After defeating your soul, interact with the corpse to return to the real world. Successfully doing so empowers you, increasing your damage and healing by 40% for 20 seconds. And finally, Void Devastation is where the boss shoots out several bombs around the arena, not unlike Void Eruption from the Void spawn earlier. Dodge these large swirlies and you should be fine. These bombs do leave a small AoE that persists for a few seconds, so beware of that. And that's it. The fight's not too complicated, easy to dodge, easy to understand. The path to the third boss is not unfamiliar. You face Exhumers, Enslavers, and Subjugated Souls. You make your way farther down the caverns and find yourself fighting spiders and bats. Baby spiders, just as earlier, do nothing. The big spiders, however, are far more deadly. The monstrous corpse spider only casts Necrotic Burst, an interruptible cast that applies a deadly poison on all players in the party. You must kick this. Game files also mention an ability called Death Venom, a poisonous sting presumably applied to the tank. I haven't seen this in my runs, but here's the information just in case. The Plague Bats are also important, but slightly less so. They cast Plague Spit, applying a slow and dot on a player. This stacks, and it's possible for all bats to target the same player. AoE stops can be useful if you're short on interrupts. You make your way farther down the cavern, fighting off more spiders until you come to a watery section of the cave. On either side of the path, a giant carrion worm will spawn. This worm primarily casts Body Slam, slamming its body and knocking back any player's hit off the platform. If you fall off, you'll need to make your way back up using the water spouts around the room. If the tank is not in melee range, the carrion worm will instead cast Fetid Spit at a random party member, dealing fair damage, so tanks will want to stay close. At 20% health, the worm retreats. This worm and the one after will return to help the boss during the boss fight. We finally arrive at boss 3, the carrion worm Bonemaw. Bonemaw is quite similar to the carrion worm seen earlier. Bonemaw casts Body Slam, knocking players back, and it also casts Fetid Spit if the tank is not near enough. Bonemaw has 3 additional abilities. The first is Corpse Breath, dealing a fair amount of group-wide unavoidable damage. Use defensive here if you can. Bonemaw also casts Necrotic Pitch, where they launch a ground AoE at the farthest player. This AoE slows players in it for a significant amount, and does some light damage. You'll use this AoE for the boss's last ability, Inhale. The boss begins to suck players in. Should you be in melee at any point in this channel, the boss will eat you and spit you out after dealing some damage to you. To prevent yourself from getting pulled into the boss, you'll want to stand in the Corpse Breath AoEs. Easy peasy. At the end of the boss's first Inhale, the boss will beckon the 2 carrion worms back to join the fight. These worms can be overwhelming, as they do body slam as well, and also deal damage through Fetid Spit. So target them and finish them off quickly. And that's the fight. While it may take a while, the fight isn't very hard. You make your way up and through to the last boss. The path there is littered with familiar mobs. Spiders to kick, bats to kick, void spawns to watch out for, and then you go through a door, watch a cutscene, fall, and now you're at the final boss. Now we're up to the last boss, Ner'zhul. Ner'zhul is a fairly simple boss fight. Their first ability is Malevolence. He turns to face a random party member and fires a large conal attack. It's a random party member, so everyone needs to be careful. Should this hit a player, it applies a dot and causes that player to deal 50% less damage for a duration. Players will want to stay relatively close to the boss, as it is easy to dodge this if you're closer. However, the boss also casts Omen of Death, spawning a beam of void that deals continuous damage. Damage dealt is relative to proximity. The farther you are, the less damage it deals. You'll want to try your best to move away from it as fast as you can. Finally, Ner'zhul spawns a wall of skeletons. You need to get behind the skeletons, but can only do so if you break one of the links in the skeleton's chain. Tanks, mark one of them, and have your party focus down that one so you can make your way safely across. This part can be tricky, so keep note of the boss's position, as you might find yourself in a difficult position to dodge Malevolence. And that's all this boss has to offer. And that's the whole dungeon. Really quite easy and pretty short. Not too many mobs, not too many abilities. Shadowmoon Burial Grounds is without a doubt the easiest dungeon among the Dragonflight Dungeon Season 1 slate. So you should be happy if you happen to get a Shadowmoon Burial Ground key. I make these videos to give players a full overview of dungeons, as I like to be well informed of dungeon mechanics myself. I hope this is helpful to you, and I'll see you in the next dungeon guide.